I think it's a moral obligation of the government to tell people that there is this viable option for people with metabolic disease. I think it is almost like withholding critical information or withholding a drug from people that would help reverse their chronic conditions. It's just far overdue that people be informed at the highest level that low carbohydrate diets are safe, sustainable, affordable, and effective.
Welcome to Metabolic Matters podcast, where we embark on conversations with thought leaders, disruptors, change agents, and passionate souls. I'm your host, Dr. Nasha Winters. Diagnosed with terminal cancer at 19 years old, my journey led me to become an integrative oncology specialist and champion of metabolic healing. Together, we'll delve into what truly matters to our guests and how you can metabolize that wisdom to transform your own metabolic health. Now let's meet today's guests. Welcome back to Metabolic Matters, the show where we metabolize science, stories, and strategies to help you thrive from the inside out. I'm your host, Dr. Nasha Winters. Today's guest has blown the lid off decades of nutrition dogma. Nina Teicholz is an investigative journalist, best-selling author of The Big Fat Surprise, and founder of the Nutrition Coalition. Her work has challenged the low-fat gospel, exposed the shaky science, propping up our national dietary guidelines, and started a global rethink of how we eat. We're diving into the truth about fat, politics of food policy, and why the USDA's guidelines may be fueling, not fixing our metabolic health crisis. And here's something I'm especially excited about. You'll be able to also hear Nina live as a keynote speaker at this year's Metabolic Health Day conference in October. It's going to be an incredible gathering of thought leaders working to shift the conversation on health and nutrition. So grab your coffee, your notebook, or maybe even a ribeye, and let's jump in. What an absolute joy to have you here. In fact, I was leaving another call right before this with a group of, at this point, several hundred clinicians from all over the globe. And when I told them, I'm sorry, guys, I have to leave early because I have to go and interview the Nina Teicholz, they all got very fangirly. So you are loved. It's such a joy to have you here, Nina. It's such a joy.
Thank you very much. It is totally my pleasure to be here with you.
So good. It was funny. I've been stalking / following you for many years, but I got to finally have a very up close, personal, intimate conversation with you last fall when you and I were presenting at a conference in South America, of all places. And we were the little English speaking, still patching together our Spanish place with each other at dinner. And we just had some amazing conversations. And I feel like they've been going on ever since. So I'm glad that we get to pick this up in a more formal environment and share your wisdom and your passion with the world.
Well, it was such a pleasure to meet you there. I mean, I feel like it was extraordinary that we had not met until then, actually, given our parallel paths in this world. So yes, I feel the same way. And I'm so delighted to be here talking to your audience. Really a pleasure and a privilege.
Well, I love it. Well, you have such a compelling story. I mean, how did you move from like an NPR reporter to an investigative journalist who started out as a vegetarian and is now one of, the big players in challenging this low-fat paradigm? And you have been so notorious for following the evidence and not the narrative. So I want our listeners to understand, what cracked the facade for you? What was the first moment that you realized something's different here, something's off?
I think many people have a story of having a serious health problem and then diving into the science and realizing for themselves what was a better and healthier diet and how they had been misinformed by all their healthcare practitioners, doctors. My story is a little different, which is I come to this as a journalist. I really didn't have an interest in nutrition, even though I probably should have, because I was always struggling with my weight and I was obsessed about food, and I was about 25 pounds heavier than I am now. And so, but nothing, no huge health emergency. And so, but I was assigned as a journalist. I was a story on trans fats by Gourmet magazine in the early 2000s, right? So now over 20 years ago. And the story on trans fats took me into this world where I started interviewing what we now call seed oils. But, really in that day, it was vegetable oil scientists. I went to their conferences. I did a very deep dive into that whole world and discovered how the trade association for seed oils had been harassing scientists who came up with disturbing findings about their products, how they would go to conferences and they had people assigned to harass other scientists about their work. And this long history of this really going back to the 70s, when there had been a scientist at the University of Maryland named Mary Enig who had found an association between seed oils and cancer, which, by the way, is also supported by more rigorous clinical trial data, and how she was just relentlessly bullied and harassed. I found other scientists with very similar stories. And that became this story for Gourmet magazine that was wildly popular for the magazine. It really, one of the most read circulated articles that they had in their recent history. Later, I learned that the editor-in-chief of that magazine had been threatened by Procter & Gamble, maker of Crisco oil, that to pull all their advertising from the magazine if they went with my story. I mean, how they even knew about it is an interesting question. But she resisted that, and she wrote in her autobiography later that it was one of the proudest moments of her journalistic life. And that also opened, a door to me into how food companies, and it turns out also pharma companies, will influence the media and media narratives and how their advertising influences what we see in publications, which definitely remains true today. But doing that story really plunged me into this world about dietary fats in general, because suddenly I was, if these are the so-called good fats that we were told to replace saturated fats with seed oils, right? Instead of butter, have margarine, etc. So what was the whole story in diet on fat, right? Low fat, good fat, bad fat, how much to fat? That's just been the central obsession of our nutrition recommendations for so long. And that is such a fascinating story about how we got it all wrong. It's really like the linchpin of how all our dietary recommendations have gone awry. And that, from the Gourmet story, I had gotten a book contract to write a book about trans fats, and that just became a much different kind of book about saturated fats, seed oils, history of our dietary guideline. But it was really an intellectual journey for me, and it was not a sudden aha moment. It was like a slow unfolding that I was skeptical of. I didn't believe. I couldn't believe we had gotten it wrong. It took me a very long time to convince myself that an alternative story was more likely true, that we could have done something so colossally wrong on fat and cholesterol. So there wasn't really one moment, it was like a slow unfolding for me of how I understood like the actual science, what the actual science really told us.
So I'm really, because I think this is super interesting, because I think people assume today when they meet you or share you or hear that you've always leaned in this direction. And what I think is so powerful that you're sharing is that you were part of the old camp, part of the old belief system, and that slowly, insidiously over time, you started to uncover other truths. And your training as a journalist helped you probably sniff out BS more so than maybe the average Joe, and got you curious to dig a bit deeper. I mean, first of all, I want to give a huge shout out to that Gourmet magazine writer to be willing to post that. Like, that just gives me goosebumps that there are people out there willing to do the right thing. And I just think that was such an incredible moment for all of us. Like, what a gift that conversation started, because could you even imagine us being here right now talking about this had she not been willing to publish that article?
Yes, I'm grateful. It was the editor-in-chief. Her name is Ruth Reichel. And yes, I mean, in retrospect, now thinking about it, I'm very grateful to her. I mean, and what I realize also is how few people there are like that now when I see what the mainstream media, how it covers these topics still to this day. And I have to assume that in addition to just a very settled mindset and sort of fearful of going outside of the status quo conventional wisdom, that there is probably a good deal of financial pressure behind all of these newspapers and magazines. So yeah, I think, well, actually, and this is maybe something we'll talk about later, but I actually think that the base that we have in the conventional media to talk about these issues has actually shrunk over the years. Like, I think the kinds of articles that I wrote and Gary Taubes and other journalists wrote a decade ago are unlikely to be, would be unlikely to be published today. And, we were writing in the New York Times. We were writing in numerous outlets that I think are just completely closed to any kind of alternative ideas on nutrition and health, sadly.
Amazing. And it's almost like you were at one point writing under the radar, but now you're on everyone's radar, which is so powerful. And so you alluded to this sort of conceived notion around saturated fat being the devil, and how you slowly started to understand there was actually weak science behind this gospel, and that there was major pushback from the industries. What for you has been the most shocking discovery you made in that research that did start to really lay the groundwork, which is what led to, your books and now your involvement in changing policy, et cetera. But talk about that piece of like the shocking discovery, but also how does it have such staying power? How has this been perpetuated for so long?
Well, I mean, just the fact that saturated fats are in no way a driver of heart disease, as we've been told, is alone a really astonishing fact. I mean, I had not eaten red meat for 25 years, avoided butter, definitely avoided cream, anything. And even without even knowing that saturated fat was the main reason. I mean, I understood from all my doctors that I should lower saturated fats. I have old medical charts where I've taken taken notes in the sidelines, like reduce your saturated fat, get it down to 6-7% of calories. So that alone was very difficult to convince myself of. But many people know this story, but the beginning of the idea that saturated fats cause heart disease goes back. We haven't always thought this way. There is a moment in time when this idea was born, and that came about from Ansel Keys, and who's a scientist at the University of Minnesota, who was a very, very powerful scientist in the 1950s. And when there was really no answer to what caused heart disease, which had been very rare in the early part of the 20th century and had risen to become the number one killer in America, Americans were in a panic. President Eisenhower himself famously had a heart attack in 1955 and was out of the Oval Office for 10 days. So there was this vacuum of information into which Ansel Keys stepped with his hypothesis, called at the time the diet heart hypothesis, that it was saturated fat and dietary cholesterol that raised your cholesterol in your blood, your serum cholesterol, and would clog your arteries, sort of fill them up with these fatty substance cholesterol deposits. And, like hot oil down a cold stovepipe would clog it and then give you a heart attack. Well, that's a very compelling image. And he was able to get his idea implanted into the American Heart Association, which he joined in 1961. Just a year later, he's able to get them to move from saying we don't really have good evidence on what causes heart disease to 100% affirming his view and issuing in 1961 the first ever advice anywhere in the world that we should reduce our saturated fat and dietary cholesterol, replace our saturated fat with seed oils as the best measure of prevention against heart disease. Ancel Keys in the same year is on the cover of Time magazine as the hero of the man who knows how to solve heart disease. And, even though he himself is described as somebody who sits down to a dinner of a beef roast only a few times a week, this was the advice for the American population. And that was the beginning of it all. That was really the beginning. That was the beginning of Americans starting to cut back on the foods that contain saturated fat. So it's red meat, eggs for their cholesterol content, full fat dairy, and replacing red meat with chicken. That was the beginning of the huge increase in the amount of chicken that we eat. And it was also the beginning of a real rise in seed oils, because seed oils were like a medical product. Like this is what you take. There were ads with Mazola oil saying, take this, rip out this page in this magazine and take it to your doctor and get a prescription for seed oils. So that was really the beginning of it all. And at the time, there was very little evidence. There was a study that Ancel Keys himself was in the middle of, had not even published the results from, but was hugely influential, called the 7-country study, in which he looked at diet and then he followed only men over time to see who then died, who came down with heart disease and who died. But the results were only out, were really 10 years later, his results came out. So 1970, they came out, and he purported to show an association between saturated fat consumption and heart disease. There's so many problems with that study. I mean, for one, he only sampled 3% of the men and their diet. And even then, they were very uncertain diet calculations. So that's the beginning of the story, which is firm dietary advice from the American Heart Association based on very little weak evidence. And, I could continue on with that story if you like, but it's that settled in as a kind of status quo belief about heart disease that has been almost really impossible to budge ever since.
Yeah, it's funny because I can't believe for how long I've been in private practice. I mean, back in the mid-90s, I was learning this information and was changing my education in naturopathic medical school was teaching. It was perpetuating these myths, right? But by the time I got into clinical practice, what we were being taught wasn't adding up with what I was seeing clinically. In fact, I was seeing the opposite to be true, that the more of these seed oils that folks were eating, actually the more inflamed they were, the more issues that were happening, more cardiovascular issues, and then started falling down the sugar path and going, well, maybe this is where the concern lies. But, today I am so grateful that when someone like I know what I say when someone still challenges, this concept that saturated fat will raise your cholesterol, or even discuss that cholesterol is the problem to begin with. I know how I respond often by saying, hey, read this book, aka The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teicholz. But how do you respond when you are met with that again and again and again? Now, you started with some of the story, but how do you kind of elevator, speech respond to it now when it just comes up so often still to this day?
Well, I think there are various arguments you can use. One is really the argument, like a common sense evolutionary argument. Humans evolved eating meat, obviously, long before we had chronic disease. And so we have evolved to eat saturated fats, the kind of fats that are in animal foods. And also and this is something that I document in my book, like humans always hunted the fattiest animals. So there's a counter argument that, animals in the wild were more lean. They didn't have as much saturated fat in them as what we're now eating. But in fact, human strategies throughout history for hunting were always to choose the fattest animals And lean animals were rejected as being inedible. Like if you follow the accounts of explorers or trappers or people making expeditions, they will kill lean deer in the winter, but then they have to discard the carcass because without the fat, they considered them inevitable. And that's something, that's a phenomenon we also call as rabbit starvation, which is you can starve on rabbits, which are very lean meat, because you don't have the fat that is necessary to process the meat, to accompany it. You need actually sufficient fat in your diet, much in greater amounts than you need protein. You need moderate amounts of protein. Fat really fuels the body. So in many ways. So that's one argument. It's just a common sense argument that I think many people can understand, especially people that have some connection to growing up on a farm or being in a rural community. Like they have some distant memory that they drank milk from a cow that was not, the cream had not been skimmed off, and they ate, regular meat from their animals, and that they were healthy and long lived.
Hi, everybody. I am Dr. Nasha Winters. And if you've been listening to me for a while, you know my North Star is this: stop chasing symptoms and start rebuilding health from the ground up. That's why we created Metabolic Regen, an education platform rooted in the Terrain 10, the framework that I've learned to apply to myself and to tens of thousands of patients over 2 decades of clinical practice and cancer care. This isn't about cramming more protocols into your brain. It's about learning to think differently, to see patterns, to read the body's terrain, and to meet patients, or even yourself, where you are. Whether you're a clinician just starting your integrative journey, or a seasoned practitioner ready to bring metabolic and mitochondrial medicine to your toolkit, Metabolic Regen is here to support you. Inside, you will find immersive courses, real case studies, mentorship, and a global network of like-minded colleagues, all of us pulling together to change the story of medicine. If you're ready to be part of that shift, join us at metabolicregen.com. Let's rebuild medicine from the mitochondria out.
I love that argument or that piece, because just a few generations ago, 80% of the human population lived in those, environments, those kind of farming, agricultural environments. And we're very connected with where their food came from. We're very connected with how they processed that food and how they ingested that food. But we've since, in the last couple of generations, switched to less than 20% of us live in that. So literally less than 20% of us know where our food really comes from and knows exactly how to process it. Where 80% of us are walking around, in sort of the mythology of this very contrived environment, very distant from nature, very distant from our near ancestry as well. So I think that's a really compelling, common sense part of the conversation.
Well, and there's sort of an ironic angle of it, which is that in my research, one of the things that I discovered over and over was that it was the very poorest people who were trying to survive on diets of grains and legumes, and what they craved more than anything in multiple written accounts you can find, all throughout history, is what they crave more than anything is meat. So we are now in a situation where our leading experts are telling us to eat like peasants. What any poor society does the moment that it attains any level of affluence is to eat more meat. And that is not accompanied by increases in disease. I mean, if you look at Spain, Italy, Greece after the war, and they dramatically increased their red meat consumption in the following decades, and their health improved. So, right. I mean, the idea that we should eat like a starving peasant, really, with poor health outcomes, more likely to have poor health outcomes than what people have always survived on best is I think it's speaks to the level of misinformation that we have absorbed and think is, we don't even realize the amount of, I guess I would call propaganda that we have absorbed. And me too. I absorbed it viscerally. Like, I didn't even know why I wasn't eating red meat. I just thought it was terrible and the worst possible food. And now in retrospect, I think, how is it possible that I had that viewpoint when it's so obvious that we evolved as a species to eat meat? But so that's one set of arguments. There's another set of arguments that I think, are compelling to me, but I'm also aware that people are not really convinced by science as much as they should be. That's just the way that we are as humans, that people feel whiplashed by the various competing scientific citations out there. But just to give your listeners a quick understanding, after the American Heart Association came out with that 1961 recommendation against saturated fat and cholesterol, there actually was an understanding and recognition amongst scientists that there was inadequate science to support that recommendation. And therefore, what unfolded over the ensuing decades was the multiple clinical trials, randomized controlled clinical trials. So like really the highest level of science evidence that you can obtain that took place all over the world. They were, most of them were funded by governments in Norway, in England, in Australia, quite a few in the United States. And altogether, some 76,000 people were studied in these experiments. And these experiments lasted years. And some of them happened in hospitals or veterans' homes where you can control what people are eating. So they're what we call highly controlled, meaning you have control over their food. You're not just giving them a diet book and saying, please try to follow these recommendations along with a little counseling. You do much better when you're actually controlling people's food. All of those clinical trials, all of them came out with the finding that people on higher saturated fat diet had no greater rate of death from cardiovascular disease or any kind of disease. So we call it cardiovascular or total mortality. That was the universal finding. And the vast majority of them also found no greater risk of death from heart disease. So heart disease is a little more of a wobbly health outcome, right? Because diagnosing heart disease can vary between doctors. Some people, there are different ways of diagnosing what people died from. So that's a little bit of a more wobbly outcome. But the really solid, definite outcomes, which is death, that is not really debatable. There's really clearly no impact of saturated fats on your cardiovascular or total mortality. And I want to say in these experiments, like people were eating in the saturated fat arm, they were eating like 18% of calories as saturated fats, which is way above what we are told to eat today, which is 10% of calories or less. So these people were eating a diet that we would consider quite rich in saturated fats and did not have adverse outcomes in terms of mortality. So that's a scientific argument. There have been like 24 meta-analyses and systematic reviews looking at all that data in the past 15 years. These have all been published, and they almost universally conclude that there's no ill effect of saturated fats. And there's certainly not the evidence to support the limits on saturated fats that we have today. And there's, the real story here is that those original clinical trials were ignored, and the reviews, those systematic reviews of the trials, have also been ignored. So what we have is not a scientific problem. What we really have is a political problem.
Ooh, girl. And, hearing this, it just gives me chills down my spine, because the same narrative is being played out, specifically in oncology world. So we've been playing this game for the past 100+ years that cancer is a entirely genetic disease, right? Entirely a disease of our genetic, nature. And yet, similar to what you just described, of all the repeated studies and research, we have done something known as these cell transfer studies, these nuclear cell transfer studies over and over again, where we have taken the healthy nuclei out of a healthy cell and replaced the nuclei of a cancer cell and done it by the opposite to show that if this was genetic, you would take that DNA like mothership, if you will, that hard drive out of the cell and replace it. If this was a genetic disease, we would turn those cells into cancer or turn those cells into healthy if that was truly a genetic disease. We had never, in multiple repeated studies globally, probably to the point of millions of cell lines and beyond, have been able to prove that this was a genetic origin, right? Not to say genes don't play a role, but they're not the starting point. They're an outcome to something else. You are describing a very similar dynamic in the food world. And food is something we all have in common around the globe, right? We all need to eat. And we're all being taught, frankly, lies about what it is that we're eating. And for someone who was a hardcore also, vegetarian for many years, vegan on top of that, I get a lot of hate mail when I talk about the fact that I eat differently today. And it's not based on any dogma. It's based on my own data, my own blood tests, my own single nucleotide polymorphisms, my own how well I'm doing physically, emotionally, across the board. And yet the culture around me and around you continues to teach that what we are seeing at the bedside is not real. And that we're all ignoring this dogma that has been handed down since the 1960s and for cancer world since the 1914 zone. But in the saturated fat world, you're so right on that. Like if you just look at your childhood or your grandparents' lives, they ate so differently than we do today. And no one was dropping dead of heart disease. And so I think this is what's so incredible is you just nailed it. This really comes down to politics. This comes down to policies. This comes down to industry-driven agendas. So can we go into the dietary guideline, which is now your magnum opus of what you're helping us hopefully change the outcomes on. So let's talk about what is the USDA number one and how would you say its current influences and where it needs to go?
Okay, so thank you for setting that stage. I'm going to take a little step back and just explain what the dietary guidelines are. So in 1980, the US became the first country anywhere in the world to issue national guidelines about what we should eat. And in the US, we decided that we would just adopt really the whole platform from the American Heart Association, which has always been like this, very close to the government, going back to 1948. So the very first guidelines were low in saturated fat, watch your dietary cholesterol, low in fat overall, because by then the overall bring total fat down, the low fat diet had come into play, eat more fruits and vegetables, that was the first dietary guidelines in 1980, which by the way also said reduce your sugar, but that was then somehow removed as we went along until about 2015. So these guidelines are reissued every 5 years. A new edition comes out. They are co-produced by the Departments of Agriculture, that's USDA, and Health and Human Services, that's HHS. And the leadership for each edition, it oscillates between those two agencies. And those guidelines have changed really very little over time. There was a period where we had the food pyramid, which we no longer have, but is still the most, I think, is the image that people associate most with the guidelines. And if you'll remember, there's that big bottom slab. It's all greens. It's breads, pasta. So it's a very high carbohydrate diet. Over 50% of calories are supposed to be consumed as carbohydrates. That's 6 or more servings of grains a day, including still 3 servings of refined grains every day. So these guidelines, they perfectly parallel the obesity epidemic in the United States, which was going along in the mid to low teens among adults in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980. The dietary guidelines come along and there's a sharp uptick in the obesity rate in the United States, which seemingly has continued going up, perhaps less so with GLP-1 inhibitors now, but that has gone up ever since. So there's a decent argument to be made that by shifting the entire American population to a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet, that we induced our epidemics of chronic disease. I think that's a pretty fair argument to make. And you can see that in the government's own consumption data of how Americans have changed their ways of eating. We've actually increased fruits and vegetables quite dramatically by 30-40% from 1970 to 2014. That's sort of the time period we have the only really good published numbers on. Meat has come down 28% during that time, whole milk down 79%, butter down about 20%, animal fats down 20 to 30%, whole grains up by about 40%. So we have largely complied with these guidelines. And even though people don't think they know about the guidelines or they don't get their diet from a .gov website, they come down, they have like a vast tentacle of arms through which they reach people through doctors, nutritionists, dietitians. Everybody follows the guidelines and delivers them to people through K through 12 education. They're followed for school lunches, hospitals, the military. I mean, they have a very extensive and far reach and power, and they do reach, I would say, almost each and every American. So, and they have been based on very weak science. They ignored all those clinical trials I discussed earlier on some 76,000 people on saturated fat. They've never reviewed those. They've never reviewed any of the large diet studies funded by the National Institutes of Health, the trials that are the most reliable data. None of those have been considered by any of the expert committees that inform the guidelines since 1980. So that's just some of my findings that have. Anyway, I won't get into all the publications that I've done on this and the various bits of hot water that I got into reporting on this. But here's where we are today. The guideline leadership is with Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. at HHS. They are the lead agency on the guidelines. They are due out by the end of this year. They're likely to come out in mid to late fall. And we don't know what they will say. I mean, I've had a little bit of an inside peek along the way, but there are many stakeholders, actors who are involved in this process, and they're juggling for their bits of language and what they want. And it really is an uncertain outcome, I would say, at this point. Right. One really bright note for me is that the FDA Commissioner, Marty McCary, has come out several times and said that the cap on saturated fat, the vilification of saturated fat was a mistake based on bad science. He's talked about Ansel Keys. He actually included a chapter on Ansel Keys in his most recent book, which he's very kind to give me some credit. And so he's come out publicly talking about saturated fats and the fact that there's not good evidence to support caps on them. Whether or not that will make it through to the final rendition of these guidelines awaits to be seen. I'm pretty sure there won't be a ban on seed oils or any very aggressive language on seed oils at this point. And I would say the other change that I anticipate, but again, not sure, is that animal proteins, including red meat, are likely to be restored to as a healthy part of a healthy diet without any prohibitions against them.
Which would be huge because we've seen the opposite kind of trickling down for some time. And, just to give the listeners some context, just to think about, up until about 12,000 years ago, we were all hunter-gatherers. And to Nina's point, we were hunting the fattiest meats we could find because they needed to sustain us. They needed to fuel us. We needed to be able to be a dual burning engine of, glucose and fats as needed seasonally wherever there was resources or lack thereof. And then we put down a few roots in the Neolithic farming era about 11-ish thousand years ago. And that was all through the Fertile Crescent part of the world. So kind of along the Mediterranean zones. And what also was introduced at that time was a whole new genetics. So the human leukocyte antigen, HLA, is what first showed up. at that time. So we clearly changed something in our food systems, that changed something in our physiology and our genetics, that left us more vulnerable to things like mold and autoimmune conditions and infections, things like that, which was probably some level of evolutionary necessity. But really, it wasn't until about early to mid 1800s did we make another big change. So we kind of look at Neolithic farming as one of the biggest changes, about 11,000 years ago. And then about 150, 200 years ago, we made another big one, which was the Industrial Food Revolution. And so this is where things started to change a lot again. And there were a lot of doctors and researchers at that time starting to sound the whistle blow that, oh, we're seeing some weird things showing up in our patient populations. And I think you talk about this, Nina, in your book, The Big Fat Surprise, was during wars is when we saw a lot of these things. So when we rationed things like sugar, our health improved. When we rationed things like breads, we didn't have as much access, our health improved. And when we went back to more of the hunter-gatherer kind of vibe, our health improved. But then as soon as we would get out of these war zones, we'd like quickly return to these commodities, to these pieces. But man almighty, did things change again after World War II. So we took all that leftover ammo and we turned it into pharma and farming, right? So pharma and ag. And so I wanted folks to have that understanding that way a lot of us believe the food systems are today, we think that's been forever. And I'm wanting people to understand how drastically different it is from how we've actually evolved. Like our genetic needs are not being met with the food sources of today. And that what Nina is speaking to here are basically whoever has been in power in the government in general, in the Health and Human Services, or in the USDA is what dictates what we're being told and what we're being served. So thinking about your most vulnerable populations, your students, your infirmed, your elderly, they're all at the mercy of USDA food guidelines to how we feed these very vulnerable populations. And so it's not a wonder that this conversation is really up in our face right now. And it's just so interesting to me. I mean, Nina, you and I have been on this journey, different reasons for being on the journey for so many decades now. And I'm just so intrigued that people are still fighting sort of like this dogma war around beliefs that eggs cause cholesterol problems and that cholesterol, the problem, or cardiovascular, or that meat is killing the planet and that the only way to heal the planet is through a vegan diet or approach, and that a factory farmed burger, a factory fake burger is going to save the planet versus, a beautiful grass-fed, grass-finished cow. Like, my gosh, how do we as people who are focused on the science, so the scientific rigor, as well as those of us who are in the field as clinicians, how do we come out ahead? Because we're not trying to be right. We're trying to help people. Our patient population globally is suffering. Half of us are expected to have a cancer diagnosis in our lifetime. 70% of us are walking around obese. More than half of us now have diabetes. Cancer's finally overtaking cardiovascular disease as the number one killer, of cause of mortality. Like, how in the world do we get off this crazy train? Loaded question, I know.
Well, when I came out with my book about a decade ago, and I founded a group called the Nutrition Coalition, and the whole goal of that group was to advocate for the science to improve our dietary guidelines under the very naive assumption that all we had to do was to present the science that was missing. Maybe they don't know. Maybe they don't know about all these clinical trials, and it's just been a faulty process. And I embarked upon an effort. I've published papers with former expert dietary guideline committee members of this expert committee. I went with these committee experts to the USDA, to HHS. I showed them the evidence, presented them the information. We submitted it formally through public comment process. We had thousands of people submit public comments about how their health improved by not following the guidelines, doing just the exact opposite. We engaged fully in this process at every level, at the grassroots level, at a high expert level. And what I realized was that there was not an interest in in science. There really was not, there was resistance to good science for a number of reasons. And that is what led me to shift my work and turn a little bit more towards these corporate, ideological, and bureaucratic forces that have that shape our understanding of nutrition policy. This is sort of an area that I don't really know very many journalists doing this. I mean, first, journalism, the field of nutrition journalism is not one where journalists ever or almost never follow the money, which is what they held journalists in other areas to do. It's always sort of a bedrock principle. But in nutrition, the journalists come mainly, they've been cookbook authors, or they come from, it's a lifestyle part of the newspaper. So it's not treated with the same kind of rigor. And there is just an enormous bias in the legacy media that has embraced a largely vegetarian diet, that also pervades all of our elite institutions. But if you draw back the curtain a little bit and look at the forces behind it, what is operating here? That's what is interested me so very much, because we're taught, again, naively, that there's this thing called a hypothesis. And then if there's evidence to the contrary, observations to the contrary, then you have to readjust your hypothesis. And there's a kind of reckoning in the honest scientific process that you need to readjust so that your ideas and your hypothesis fits the observations. Like your observation, my patients are getting better on a diet very different than the one that the American Cancer Society recommends. Those kinds of observations need to be absorbed into your scientific thinking. That has so not happened in nutrition. I mean, just the contrary. So just to review a little bit for your readers, I mean, the most benign explanation is that there is something called cognitive dissonance, which is it's very difficult for anyone in any field to reverse themselves on a career spent believing one thing, right? So scientists at Harvard who spent 40 years proving that saturated fat is bad for health, that the vegetarian diet is better, they're not reversing course. And that is largely due to cognitive dissonance. Institutions like the American Heart Association or USDA also have a form of cognitive dissonance, which is amplified by the fact that they do not want to lose the public's trust by flip-flopping on their policies. They will avoid saying I'm wrong. If there are changes, they will bury them. Just to give you a little example, the cap on dietary cholesterol, the reason we've avoided egg yolks for so long, it disappeared in 2015 or 2013 for the American Heart Association, 2015 for the US dietary guidelines. But there was zero announcement to the public, almost nothing. So there's like a retreat from a position, probably for legal reasons, maybe, I don't know, but there's no acknowledgement of that, and that's because I think in large part they do not want to lose the public's trust and be seen as unreliable.
They lost my trust a long time ago.
There's crisis in public trust that we're now experiencing. And then there's blaming sort of the social media mobs for undermining our public health institutions. No, our public health institutions have lost the trust because they have given us unreliable, incorrect advice. And until that advice is corrected, they will not regain public trust, unfortunately, which is a very hard lesson to learn. But let's just talk about another really obvious force, which are the financial and conflicts of interest that really pervade nutrition science, right? And at every level. So when you were talking about the industrial food revolution, 1940 is the year that these nascent, what we now call ultra processed food companies like Heinz, Standard Biscuit Corporation, and others formed a foundation whose sole aim was to fund nutrition science in their interest. So that was the beginning of manipulating science towards their end. The most, ludicrous potential example, although there are so many, is just like the cereal company funding a study showing that eating more cereal helps you lose weight. And there was a similar study by a pasta company, eat more pasta and that will help you lose weight. Well, I think that's a non-credible finding. But you will find behind any nutrition scientist a long list of food companies that have funded their research. In part, that's because there's not much funding coming out of the NIH, but also pharma companies. When I first started out, I couldn't understand, wait, you're studying food. Why is pharma funding you? Well, it seems now obvious to me that pharmaceutical companies want you to be taking your medicine, your pills and your drugs. And that's a huge profit model for them, for the average American to be having 4 or 5 pills a day that they take. Or as you get older, it's 9 to 10. So that is, they make their money by chronic disease, among other things. And that's a real sweet spot for them. Or they will have products that directly compete with weight loss through a natural food diet. So there was a member of the expert committee for the dietary guidelines who he was the medical director for, I think it was Optifast, one of those Nestle brands. And he was also getting funds from Nestle. And he was the medical director of one of those, I don't know, that's like a shake that you make that's supposed to replace food. So how can you be advising on a food-based way to improve disease when you are completely invested in a non-food way? I mean, another example was a scientist from Harvard, also on the same expert committee, who was getting money from, it was from the Mounjaro or one of those, the Novo Nordisk, which makes these weight loss injections, who went on 60 Minutes to say, obesity is a genetic disease. Well, this is like your story about cancer being genetic. I mean, if you believe that obesity is a genetic disease, why are you even on a panel to try to figure out potential dietary solutions to a disease that's already been determined genetically?
Wow.
I'll just give you one more example because I think it reflects some of the more current and perhaps less obvious to some corporate influences on our dietary policy, which is yet another member of this committee was a very well-known Stanford scientist whose entire center has been underwritten by Beyond Meat, which is a fake meat company whose larger investor was, maybe still is, Bill Gates. He's a committed vegan / vegetarian himself. And so he comes with this enormous bias. And I mention him in part because those companies, that food sector, which is, I would say, relatively recent compared to our standard ultra-processed food companies, but these new fake alternative protein cell-based meats that aim to replace real food are a major economic powerhouse. And they have invested a lot of money in trying to steer the conversation on nutrition and health. So that isn't not even a complete glimpse at the various institutions and interests that are aligned to try to steer us towards a not healthy diet where you can consume ultra-processed, unhealthy foods, and then you treat them with pills, medical devices, treatments.
Hi, everybody. I am Dr. Nasha Winters. And if you've ever felt that conferences can be shiny distractions rather than movement builders, you're not alone. That's exactly why Metabolic Health Day Conference is different. This October, we are gathering trailblazers who are shifting the narrative on what health and healing can be. Join me, Dr. Nasha Winters, alongside visionaries like Dr. Zach Bush, Dr. Deborah Davis, Nina Teicholz, Bob Jones, Dr. Mindy Peltz, Dr. Perry Nicholson, Dr. Dawn Huber, Amy Myers, and Katie Deming, and many, many more. Together, we'll explore the metabolic roots of chronic disease through the lens of mitochondria, terrain, and regenerative systems. This isn't about hype or hydrogen chains. It's about building meaningful and science-driven community. Be part of this movement at metabolichealthday.life. Reserve your spot now because real change starts when we gather with a purpose.
Let's get everything out of the way and just think eating seasonal, local, regional, as clean and as close to its natural, origin as possible. If we got back to that, we would eliminate a lot of the concerns and issues you and I are talking about right now. But we've created this whole new food system since the 1800s and since the 1940s and definitely beyond it's almost like we all have amnesia of what used to be. And now we question, people like you and I get questioned where we're like, can we just get this is just let's use some common sense here. And so, I think you're speaking to, first of all, the fact that 93% of Americans are now considered metabolically unhealthy. And that actually fits pretty well in most developed countries around the globe. So let's even be conservative and say 75% of us are metabolically unhealthy across the globe. I think it's pretty obvious that we can track the dietary guidelines and how they have failed us over decades that have led to some of the metabolic health crisis we're now facing. And I think you're really pointing out a need for transparency and reform, a need for independent research, funding for that independent research, because that's one of the big pitfalls there. You are now able to speak a little more, a little less carefully on your Substack, Unsettled Science. So folks can follow you there to get more information. Is that correct? Because some of the things, like if you try to publish now, you get deplatformed. If you try and talk about this in certain environments, you get deplatformed. So folks really want to follow the money and follow the science. I think following you on Unsettled Science Substack is a really good resource. I think reading A Big Fat, Surprise is a massive resource. And I can't believe when you say 10 years old, I feel like I just read it. It was such a relevant book. I felt like we were waiting for this book and waiting for you for my entire career. No, thank you.
Send me a copy for anybody who's interested. But it is still really the only, I would say highly readable for a general audience account of how we got the dietary guidelines that we did, what were the who are the actors, what's the story. It is kind of a really rip-roaring story, actually, with pretty interesting characters. So,
and they're still the center of the story. That's what I think is so interesting is you really, really brought attention to this, and yet not much has changed.
Well, I think that through the work that I did with the Nutrition Coalition, that we were able to elevate the dietary guidelines from a complete non-issue to a really centerpiece, a central topic of discussion and now reform under the current administration. So, we were able to get 2 allocations of $1 million each by Congress for the National Academy of Sciences to study the USDA dietary guideline process. That came out with a whole report really making it clear that our guideline process needed to be reformed. There's actually a line in that report that without reform, our dietary guidelines will not be reliable, that they consistently fail in a number of aspects, including lack of transparency. So we were able to do that. We really, if you look at all the dietary guideline articles, either I'm quoted in them or I helped write them, or there's now an academic literature on the guidelines that I've either supported or been a co-author on. So I feel like we've sort of laid a foundation for change that now makes it possible that this change will occur. It's legitimate. It's hard in Washington, I think, to create change. If you have a National Academy of Sciences report at your back, that's the kind of, that's the brick that you need to convince various government agencies and others that you are rightfully making changes as determined necessary by the National Academy of Sciences. So I think that we did lay a foundation for change that I'm now hopeful will happen.
Well, how can we, what is the call to action to us, to the listeners? Because you've laid this groundwork. How can we now build on it?
Well, one thing that we're doing, because even though I do have some inside access to the dietary guideline process, I think a major issue for our community will be advocating for a low carb option in the dietary guidelines. Okay, so there needs to just be one option, not for everybody, but for people who are metabolically unwell, which, as you said, pretty high portion of the adult population. For them, it needs to be stipulated in the dietary guidelines that a low carbohydrate diet is a viable evidence-based option. Okay, so why is this important? It's important because the dietary guidelines, whatever any of us might think about them, they're hugely influential and they're considered the gold standard. So practitioners that I knew have gotten in trouble for prescribing low carbohydrate diets to their patients or censured and so if they could have the dietary guidelines at their back, that would enable them to safely, securely prescribe low carb diets to their patients. It would allow institutions to have them. It could lead to, say, low carbohydrate diets being served in hospitals where most people are metabolically unwell, or at least having the option. Having that option is important. It's also legally required, I believe, in my reading of the law. There's a law that authorizes the guidelines, and that goes back to 1990, and it says the guidelines must be for the general public. Well, the general public is now unwell. And so there must, in my view, legally be an option for these unwell people, or it will be in violation of its authorizing statute. And beyond that, I think it's a moral obligation of the government to tell people that there is this hugely, this viable option for people with metabolic disease. I think it is almost like withholding critical information or withholding a drug from people that would help reverse their chronic conditions. It's just far overdue that people be informed at the highest level that low carbohydrate diets are safe, sustainable, affordable, and effective.
Oh my gosh. And just again, for the listener to understand, there's entire now metabolic psychiatry, metabolic oncology, metabolic, cardiology, all of these fields, all of these sort of silos of the illnesses that plague us the most are all grassroots movements of people from high up in academic institutions that are allowing a new path forward, talking about the importance of carb restriction in a lot of these vulnerable populations. And so the fact that there are people doing and publishing clinical trials on things like carbohydrate restriction in schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, even in anorexia, and then in the cardiology world, the oncology world, it's being talked about at the bedside, but we do need to make it more at that policy level. And Nina has given us the opportunity, a foundation in which to build. And so our listeners, if you had a recommendation of where, obviously your book, we'll have that in the show notes. We'll have your Substack in the show notes. But are there any other resources you think folks should be involved in or sign up for to make sure that they can be part of the solution instead of part of the problem?
Well, if you'd like to be involved in the campaign to advocate for a low carb option in the dietary guidelines, I would suggest to people to go to nutritioncoalition.us and sign up for the newsletter. Just put it's just your mailing address, or your email, and then you won't get a lot of emails because we just we have low staff. So but you will get an email when we start this campaign. And that's the important thing. You just put it out on social media, you share it with your friends. We have a bunch of graphics that you can just share and post. And it's not that we want to be antagonistic to the current administration. I think people have very mixed feelings about who's in leadership, but we want to show that there is public support for this idea. I mean, we really need to show that patients, practitioners, people who love truth, people of all walks of life who feel like this really needs to change. And to all of those who would say we should just abolish the dietary guidelines, which is routinely a response that I get. And I actually agree with, I just don't think it's realistic at this point. It's so entrenched. There's so many companies that sort of feed off of it. It's nutrition assistance programs. So I think we have to just back up to the next most realistic goal, which is at least getting it to reflect the science, the current and most rigorous science as best as possible.
And I really want to reiterate, you've said this a few different ways during this conversation. This is not it's become a political situation, but what you are describing right now and what I am for is not political. This is about humanity. This is about saving our tushes because we are sick and getting sicker. And it starts at the end of our fork. And so I really think this is such an important conversation. I'm so proud that you are part of this movement and such a leader in this movement. So for the last moment, I'm going to run through what I call my rapid fire questions. So just your gut instinct of how you'd respond. You ready? Hold on to your seats, everybody. Here we go. All right. First question, ribeye or salmon?
Ribeye.
Okay. Next one, butter or olive oil?
Butter.
Worst piece of nutrition advice you've ever heard?
Fat makes you fat.
Most underappreciated nutrient?
B12.
Biggest myth about fat that still drives you crazy?
Well, what I just mentioned, that fat makes you fat is the biggest, or said saturated fat causes heart disease.
Love it. Love it. One thing you would ban from every American pantry today?
Boxed cereals.
Ooh, I like it. Awesome. Well, I mean, hopefully by the end of this, everyone else knew that would how you would be responding to those rapid fire questions. But I'm hoping it stops people in their tracks to think about how they might answer those questions as well, and maybe dig a little bit deeper as to why you may answer in a certain way. Check your own cognitive dissonance. This is what we're all asked to do on a regular basis. So, Nina, it is an absolute delight to be with you. I'm very much looking forward to you also being a keynote speaker at our Metabolic Health Day conference. You are one of the people that is a gold star in my life and helps me feel hopeful about our future. And I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for being with all of us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to see you and talk to you, and really a delight to share this conversation. Thank you.
Wow. Yet another amazing conversation. A huge, huge thanks to Nina Teicholz for her fearless work uncovering the truth about nutrition, science, and policy. If today's episode made you rethink what's on your plate, I encourage you to dive into her book, The Big Fat Surprise, check out the Nutrition Coalition, and subscribe to her Substack, Unsettled Science. And remember, if you want to go even deeper with Nina and other trailblazers in this field, join us in October at the Metabolic Health Day conference. It's a powerful opportunity to learn, connect, and be part of reshaping the future of health. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone you care about. It helps us bring more voices and more truth to light. Until next time, stay curious, stay nourished, and remember, your metabolism matters. Thanks so much for watching this episode of Metabolic Matters. If something in today's conversation resonated with you, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and tap the notification bell so you never miss a new exciting episode. Drop your thoughts or questions in the comments, as we'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to check the description below for show notes, guest links, and additional resources to support you and your journey. You can always follow us on Instagram and across social media at Metabolic Matters for updates, insights, and behind-the-scenes content. And a heartfelt thank you to Julie Newmark and Whiskey Flower for the beautiful music that brings this show to life. Until next time, stay empowered, stay curious, and keep metabolizing what matters.